Good morning. Let's start Matthew 6 this morning. If you have your Bibles, Matthew chapter 6, as we build to the 23rd chapter of Matthew. What a great weekend we've had together. Had the blessing, those of us men that were there Friday evening to sit at the feet of Jeremy Hood. And then last night, many of us, male and female alike, had the opportunity to sit at the feet of Jeremy Hood, and I just want you to know that I begged him to preach this morning. And he said no. So you're stuck with me. A lot of people tell me about the old type of preaching, the old hellfire and brimstone type of preaching, and I got to be honest with you, I'm not old, so I don't preach old style, okay? I get to hellfire and brimstone about 2 times a year, and you're just so lucky that you're here on one of them. This is about as close as I get, you know. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 2, the Bible says this: "Thus when you give the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. I tell you, they already have their reward." In verse 5 of the same chapter, Jesus says, "Like the hypocrites, for they stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners in order to be seen by others. I tell you, they have received their reward." And if you hadn't got it yet, go down to verse 16, and Jesus says, "And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others." Let me tell you one more time, they have received their reward. When you come over in your Bible to the 15th chapter of Matthew's account, and you begin in verse 7. I'm in Matthew 15 and I'm in verse 7. "You hypocrites! Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they do worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men.'" I come to the 22nd chapter of the book of Matthew, and I come to verse 18. In Matthew 22 and verse 18, Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites?" I just simply entitled this lesson, "Calling All Hypocrites." And look at the crowd we have this morning. Man. I'm kidding, right? But I am asking us, in a very serious and a real way, to analyze our lives and to see if perhaps there is some area of hypocrisy. Because as we study together today from the 23rd chapter of the book of Matthew, there is a sentence that will be handed out to those who practice hypocrisy. And it's not a good one. Jesus has been encountering the scribes and the Pharisees over and over and over. And in Matthew chapter 6 and in Matthew chapter 15 and in Matthew 22, He refers to them all by the same name: hypocrites. When you look up the word hypocrite in the original Greek, it literally means an actor in a play that is substituting their own lifestyle for the role of another. It literally means to put on a mask and wear a mask in order to disguise yourself, in order to become something you're not. In the first 12 verses that Jeff read a moment ago, we learn a lot about these Pharisees. Go back to those 12 verses just real briefly with me and remind yourself that, number one, they don't practice what they preach. Did you hear what he said in verse 3? You almost get stumbled on your own words there. Do what they tell you to do, but realize that they don't do what they tell you to do. Right? A little confusing there, but the bottom line is They preach well, but they don't practice what they preach. And we call that, in very simple terms, hypocrisy. When someone claims to be something that they're not. Notice what he says in verse 4 about the hypocrites. They tie or they place or they hold over you heavy burdens that they're not even willing to move their finger to try to bear, but they want you to bear them. Namely, what he said back there in Matthew 15 and verse 9 when he was quoting from Isaiah, the commandments that they present, they present them as commandments of men. As of God, rather, but they're really from men. In other words, they are teaching you the traditions of man, and they have elevated them to be that of the doctrine of God, and they're putting a burden on you that is unfair for you to have to bear. Who is? The hypocrites, the Pharisees and scribes. In verse 5, we learn that all they care about is being seen by men. And in verse 6 and 7, we go on to learn that they desire the most prestigious places and they deserve to be honored. They deserve to be praised. They not deserve, but they desire rather. And they desire to be called rabbi. Rabbi. In other words, when we come into the place, we want to be seen by men. We want to be set in the position of authority or power. And when you refer to us, we want you to call us by the proper name. Don't get it wrong. Hypocrites. Only desiring to be seen of man and to be glorified by man and to be praised by man, only to ignore the one they really need to be seen by. And that is God. Hypocrites. At the end of the Bible reading this morning in verses 11 and 12, we learn that they desire to be great. And you know how they desire and they think that greatness really comes? Go back and read chapter 20, because they had influenced the disciples that were following Jesus. And so they viewed greatness as being able to sit on the right and the left hand. And Jesus says, if anyone's going to be great, let him be a servant. And then he goes on in verse 12 and says, for those who have exalted themselves, they will be humble. The Pharisees were those people who were prideful, they were arrogant, they were haughty, they exalted themselves, and Jesus says they will be abased. They will be brought low. The hypocrite. And then he begins in verse 13 with the bulk of the chapter, and he begins with these words, but woe to you. I don't know if woe is in your common vernacular or not, but I've heard it a few times in my life. And every time I've heard the word woe, it means danger ahead. It means that something bad is about to happen if you don't correct the direction quickly or stop the forward momentum. When we read the word woe in Matthew 23, what we learn is that God is sorrowful for the spiritual status of these people. God is in agony over the spiritual place that these Pharisees and scribes find themselves. And of course, it is called hypocrisy. God is upset. God is displeased. God is angry. God is in grief and sorrow. And thus the word woe. Woe. Is it the case that by the way that we are living, we are causing God to be sorrowful? Is it the case that something in our lives is causing God to grieve? Causing God to be separated from us? causing God to be disappointed in us because of our hypocrisy. Is there something out there that God is screaming to Rodney right now going, whoa, there is danger ahead, and if you don't correct your direction quickly, or if you don't stop your forward momentum entirely, you're headed for a disastrous sentence. At least 7 of them here in Matthew 23. 7 woes. Now we like the number 7, don't we? If you're reading a King James Version or a New King James Version, you have a 14th verse in Matthew 23. And so therefore you have 8. I'm not convinced that, and I'm not trying to get to the number 7. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just not convinced that based on manuscript evidence that verse 14 was in the original, okay? But verse 14 does not do anything to change the text where Jesus says, if He does, in verse 14, but woe to you, and that would be an 8th one, because they're mistreating the widows. And they're taking advantage of them, and that's just right on par with everything else that's going on. But look at these 7 with me very quickly, beginning in verse 13. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, which, by the way, He calls them that 6 out of 7 times. The only time He varies from that is in a moment in verse 16 when He uses the terms blind guides. But the other 6 times, or perhaps 7, He says hypocrites. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut the kingdom of heaven in people's faces, and you neither enter yourselves nor allow them to go in. Jesus says, because of your hypocrisy. Notice what happens here. You not only turn people off to the kingdom of heaven, but you are turned off yourself. By the way you live and by the way you conduct yourself and by the manner with which you uphold, and when people see through your hypocrisy, they have a bad taste in their mouth about God, about Christianity, about religion, and oh, by the way, you're missing the boat too. Now, if I understand Scripture correctly, we're called to evangelize. We are called to teach others the good news, the message of Christ and the cross. And Jesus begins here in Matthew 23 by saying one of the greatest hindrances to being able to help people see the need for their soul's salvation is hypocrisy on the part of God's children. Because those who claim to be religious and conduct themselves in a hypocritical way shut the door of heaven to those who would want to go in, but also for themselves. In verse 15 then, the second one we find, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he becomes one, catch this now, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Typically, when we hear the word proselyte, what we think about is a Gentile being converted to Judaism. That is a proselyte. One who is of the Gentile nationality, adopting and accepting, including everything, including circumcision, to the point of, for the males, to the point of becoming a Jew, and therefore a proselyte. But what's going on here in Matthew 23:15 has nothing to do with Judaism. It has everything to do with Phariseeism. You are taking Jew and Gentile alike, and you are converting them to the heathen way of life that the Pharisees are upholding. You are making them a proselyte to Phariseeism. And thus by doing so, they are not only lost, they are twice as lost as they were when they started. There's nothing pretty about this picture, I'm sorry. It's just doom and gloom for the scribes and the Pharisees, for the hypocrites. The sentence is there and it's not good. Verse 16, woe to you, blind guides. And then he goes on in verse 17 to say, blind fools. I don't know about you, but I had never been many places in my life where I was guided. I've been very few places where I had someone guiding me on any number of things that you could be guided on, a tour of sorts, a mission of sorts. Just very few times in my life that I have been guided. But I just cannot, unless you're trying to be guided through the philosophies of Braille, okay, I cannot figure a place where a blind guide would be very good. Or maybe someone who is blind would be just the right guide to help me learn how to read Braille. They would be perfect at it, wouldn't they? But outside of that, I don't think I want to go into any caves with a blind guide. How about you? I don't think I want to go on any mission trips with blind guides. I don't think I want to tour any type of building or stadium or with someone who is blind guiding me. You see, it's not valuable. It has no value because what you need is eyesight to be able to help someone in the position of a guide. And he says to the Pharisees, you can't see. You hypocrites, foolish are you, verse 17. And then you read verses 18, 17, 18 and following. He says in verse 19, blind men. They're arguing over whether the temple is more important or the gold, rather, is more important on the altar or what is being laid on the altar. And he's saying to them, what are you missing here? Are you missing the point of holiness? Are you missing the point of sanctification? What makes the gold in the temple important to start with? It's the presence of God, and you're missing that because you're so focused on the value of which is more important, this or that. Verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe and mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of law like justice, mercy, and faithfulness. Tithing was a huge part of the Old Covenant, right? And then you get into this dill and cumin, and those are seeds and herbs that were divided and given and separated in proper proportions. And what Jesus is saying is that listen, guys, you give exactly what you're supposed to give. Great job. You do exactly what God is. You separate the seeds and the herbs just like you've been instructed. Great, good job. But do you realize that how little those seeds are, and think about what you're neglecting? And weightier here does not have anything to do with difficulty. It has everything to do with importance. You are ignoring the important things by straining at gnats. You remember that verse? It's right here, Matthew 23. And swallowing camels. In other words, you're making sure that everybody gets every T and every I dotted in these little things. In other words, you're majoring in the minors. Hypocrites. You're majoring in the minors and you're missing the major things of religion. And go on in verse 24 and see that, or verse 23 rather at the end, and see that he doesn't tell them to quit tithing, or he doesn't tell them to quit separating the mint and the dill and the cumin, but rather while you are doing those things, don't neglect those things. But make sure that you realize that things like mercy and justice and faithfulness are important, more important. Verse 25, woe to you scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And in verse 25 with number 5, we connect number 5 and number 6 together because they have this same message. Listen to verse 25. You clean the outside of the cup and the plate, but inside it's full of greed and self-indulgence. Look at verse 27. Woe, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, you're like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly are beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones and all uncleanliness. Number 5 and number 6, verse 25 and 27, deal with the same issue. It's the issue of the heart. It's the issue of cleanliness on the inside. It is the issue of righteousness that is on the inside. And here's the point from verse 26 and verse 28. If you and I will work on the inside, the outside will take less time. Did you hear that? If you and I will start with our hearts and get it right on the inside, the outside will take less effort because it will naturally overflow from the inside. You take the plate and you wash it on the outside and you make it look really good. And then you look at the inside where the food lays and there's crumbs still there. And there's ketchup stains still there. Boy, I can't wait to just take that plate and put more food on it. How about you? But you make so much effort to clean the outside. And what you don't even realize is that on the inside you're defiled. I speak from experience. I've seen a lot of money go in the ground. Literally. Okay? I've let a lot of people down into the ground and put dirt over them, and I have buried thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars. It's beautiful, folks. It's beautiful. You can buy any color you want. It's pretty. You can buy it with any type of hardware you want on it. You can put it in any kind of vault you want to put it in. At the end of the day, and while I'm not condemning the practice of any of that, all I'm simply getting you and I to realize is that you look at it on the outside, and on the inside, it is still a dead person. That's all it is. And that's all it ever will be. There's no soul there. There's no spirit there. It's just the flesh of someone. And he says, that's what you are on the inside. You're just a bag of dead bones. But you got the outside looking great. Go to the inside. Look at the inside. Clean up the inside. Woe to you, verse 29, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous. And you said if we'd lived in the days of our fathers, we wouldn't have taken part in killing the prophets like they did. Thus it is written against you yourselves that you are sons of those who murder the prophets, and you fill up. You not only do it, but you are filling it up. You are really rising to the occasion to kill the righteous. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, claiming to be something you're not, and suggesting that, if we'd lived in the time of our fathers, we wouldn't have been like them. No, that's not right. You're worse than them. Killing the prophets, building tombs for the prophets, putting the righteous to death, or silencing the righteous, all for the sake of your hypocrisy. Don't miss verse 33. There's the sentence, and it's not good. You serpents, you brood of vipers. I got to be honest with you. I'll let you call me one name, okay? I'll even stand there and look at you while you call me something. I don't care. I'm offering, I'm giving you the opportunity to call me a name. Call me a name. I don't care. But I'm not going to stand there and let you call me too. You feel my drift? Somebody is going to be eliminated from the situation. And I don't mean anything physical necessarily. I'm just leaving, okay? You're not going to stand there and call me two names. And here in verse 33, Jesus says, He's been calling names all the way through this business. But then in verse 33, He calls them two additional names. You serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? And the answer is you ain't. The reality of it is that that's exactly where you're headed. That's exactly the sentence. That's exactly the judgment for hypocrites. That's exactly the eternal destiny for those who are playing the part, literally on stage, playing the part with a mask on when it comes to Christianity. You need to realize that actions can be religious without righteousness. Actions can be religious without righteousness. Go back and read verses 2 and 3. Their actions are very religious. They are teaching and preaching. They are anything but righteous. Actions can be religious without being beneficial. Go back to verse 15. What an awesome statement to proselyte yourself to the doctrines and to the religion of something that has been so well communicated to you. How religious that is. But folks, they're being converted to Phariseeism and there is no benefit. Actions can be religious without being beneficial. And then also consider with me this morning that actions can be religious without being adequate. Well, God, I'm just being this wonderful religious human being, and God may be saying, "Oh, that's all well and good, but boy, you sure are missing some important stuff." Did you read verse 23? Did you catch that they were being religious? But their religiousness was not adequate because they were neglecting some of the more important things of the desires of God. Actions can be religious without being adequate. And so here's what I'm asking you this morning. Is what I am doing righteous or is it religious? Is what I am doing beneficial or is it just religious? Is what I am doing adequate or is it just religious? Because if I understand it correctly, the Pharisees were very, 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 very religious. And He said to them in verse 33, your sentence is to hell. What does our lives look like? You see, what God is doing this morning is He's calling all hypocrites. And He's saying, come. He's calling all hypocrites to say, resolve right now, today, to stop acting like that. He's calling all of us who may be proclaiming to be one thing, but living another way. He's begging for us to resolve right now to cease desire to be righteous, desire for your soul to be benefited, and desire for what you do in your walk of Christianity to be adequate in the eyes of the Lord. And if it's not, well, the invitation's yours. Come now as we stand and sing.